Hello, this is Dr. Luis Peña-Lévano, and today I am presenting climate change interactions with agriculture, forest, sequestration, and food security. This research article has been written in collaboration with Dr. Farzad Taheripour and Dr. Wallace Tyner, and has been awarded the 2019 Best Paper published in Environmental and Resource Economics. The presentation outlines the following. Literature suggests forest carbon sequestration is a good alternative to mitigate climate change due to its ability to sequester carbon at low cost. Nevertheless, forest carbon sequestration subsidies have not been addressed together with impacts on food security and climate change-reduced crop yields. In this article, we evaluate the global economic impacts of using carbon taxes and forest carbon sequestration subsidies to achieve 50% emission reductions. We develop a new version of a computable general equilibrium model entitled GTAT-BIO FCS for the economic analysis. We also collected data to reflect the impacts of climate change on agricultural productivity. We find that implementing an aggressive forest carbon sequestration incentive can cause substantial increases in food prices because of land competition between forest and crop production. Our results show that without climate change impacts on agriculture, forest carbon sequestration is attractive. But when we include climate change impacts on crop yields, food price increases are significantly large, so large that it is clear this approach could not be adopted in the real world. The results of this article cry out for investment in agricultural research on climate adaptation. The results also show that economic well-being falls more without mitigation than with 50% emission reductions. In recent decades, economic expansion and population growth have triggered acceleration in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, the most important contributor to global warming. Most economic sectors contribute to these emissions. Among them, we have agricultural activities, non-renewable energy generation, and transportation based on fossil fuels. Agriculture alone was responsible for about 11% of greenhouse gas emissions in 2012. Climate change may affect the productivity of agricultural crops depending on the type of crop and location. For example, C4 plants such as corn are more resistant to climate variability than C3 plants. Likewise, an increase in temperature acts differently in a boreal region such as Canada than in an already warm place such as Ecuador. A reduction in crop yields may bring deficiencies in food supply, in particular as agricultural products are own-price inelastic, and therefore this could cause increases in food prices. Forests help to reduce greenhouse gases by sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as part of their photosynthesis process. For this reason, forest carbon sequestration is considered by the literature as a cost-efficient alternative to mitigate climate change. However, as pointed out by Golub et al., forest carbon sequestration incentives could increase livestock and food prices. In the same line of reasoning, Hussain et al. Mentions that forest carbon sequestration subsidies could elevate poverty in less developing economies. Songen shows in his article that in order to keep the temperature increase only by 2 degrees Celsius, forest carbon sequestration must increase by 178%, and the required carbon price should be $130 per ton of CO2 to compensate the opportunity cost of land transferred to forest. Taking into consideration these facts, our study aims to improve our understanding of the interplay between climate change mitigation policies, and their impacts on the global economy. Specifically, we address 5 questions. What is the cost of emission reduction without forest carbon sequestration incentives? Then, what are the costs if we incorporate forest carbon sequestration subsidies? What are the impacts of forest carbon sequestration on food security? And what are the global consequences when we include the climate change impacts on crop yields? Our last question compares the situation with and without mitigation to understand what are the net economic benefits of reducing the adverse effects on crop yield losses. To fulfill our objectives, we elaborated a multidisciplinary approach in which we evaluated different climate change scenarios. Each scenario is composed by an emission reduction policy and crop yield projections. We inserted these climate change scenarios in our model GTAT Bio FCS. Our model is a computable general equilibrium model, also known as CGE models. These types of models include regional input-output tables and economic parameters, and the equations in the model determine the production and demand of commodities and the allocation of land and other inputs. GTAP Bio FCS incorporates features of 2 important GTAP models, GTAP AZ GHG and the GTAP Bio. The data contains the most important greenhouse gases, forest carbon stocks, and biofuels. We associated each emission to its source. For consumption, we linked each emission to the quantity purchased of these products. For production, emissions are considered dirty inputs in the production function. The forest carbon sequestration supply is based on the global timber model developed by Songen and Mendelssohn. We divide the carbon sequestration into 2 sources, forest land and forest biomass. This permits to implement the sequestration subsidy to each of these inputs. The climate change impacts on crop yields are collected from the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project. The data is provided at the grid cell resolution. Two scenarios were collected, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, which represent mitigation and business as usual, respectively, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In order to obtain our crop yield shocks, we aggregated this data by region, crop, and agroecological zone. In our study, we have 5 scenarios. In our first scenario, we impose a carbon tax to reduce 50% of global emissions, which represents the mitigation scenario. Then, we impose a carbon tax and an equivalent forest carbon sequestration subsidy to achieve the same target in emission reduction. The next 2 scenarios impose similar mitigation policies, but they also include the climate change impacts on crop yields. Therefore, these 4 scenarios include mitigation efforts. The last scenario represents what happens if we continue production and consumption as usual. This scenario does not include mitigation efforts, but it includes the impact of climate change on crop yields if we continue activities business as usual. Each of these 5 cases are implemented in our GTAT-Bio FCS to evaluate the changes in greenhouse gas emissions, consumption, welfare, production, and land use. In terms of emission reduction, imposing a carbon tax to reduce global emissions by 50% will require a carbon price of $150 per ton of CO2. This will drive reductions in emissions in carbon-intensive industries, in particular electricity, which will represent about 41% in the emission reduction effort. When combining the carbon tax with a forest carbon sequestration subsidy, this encourages forest expansion, and forest alone is able to capture 3 additional gigatons of carbon dioxide, which is equivalent to 1/5 of the emission reduction effort. In addition, this combination of policies drives down the carbon price to almost half. When we incorporate the climate change impacts on crop yields, we see that under a carbon tax regime, the contribution of each sector in the mitigation effort is similar to the case without crop yield shocks. But under a carbon tax and an equivalent forest carbon sequestration subsidy, because crop yield is reduced, more land is required for food production and land is taken away from forest, which means that there is less forest carbon sequestration. For this reason, forest share goes from 21 to only 14% in the emission reduction effort. In terms of forest cover, implementing a carbon sequestration subsidy increases afforestation, and therefore this increases forest carbon sequestration in many regions of the world, especially places with vast forests such as Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. This incentive increases global forest by about 701 million hectares. This is the case without climate change impacts. Nevertheless, if we incorporate the adverse effects of climate change on agricultural productivity, because crops are overall less productive, many places reduce forest cover, making forest carbon sequestration a less attractive alternative. For this reason, the forest carbon sequestration incentive will only increase global forest by 560 million hectares. Now let's look at what happens to commodity prices. Let's start by looking at the case of carbon-intensive sectors such as paddy rice and ruminants. If we impose a carbon tax, which is represented by the blue bars, the production of both sectors will be heavily penalized by the tax due to their carbon intensity, especially in developing economies. Adding a forest carbon sequestration subsidy to the policies, which is represented by the yellow bars, will lead to move land away from pasture toward forest. Because of the reductions in pasture land, this may drive up livestock prices, especially for ruminants. And the result for the ruminant sector will depend on the emission intensity and changes in pasture land. For commodities with low carbon footprint, such as wheat and sugar crops, the combination of the carbon tax and the equivalent forest carbon sequestration subsidy will cause more drastic increases in prices compared to only imposing a carbon tax. And there are two reasons for this. First, there is a large reduction in cropland area due to the forest expansion. And second, there are overall losses in crop productivity. In other words, land becomes a scarcer resource, and this scarce land is less productive. But if we compare the changes in food prices to a business as usual case, which is represented by the red bars, we can see that the prices under business as usual will increase more dramatically than any of the two mitigation policies. Finally, let's evaluate economic well-being, which in economics is usually measured in terms of welfare. Here we have two tables that represent the welfare in the 5 scenarios, in billions of dollars, for developed and emerging economies. Without climate change impacts, which are the first two columns in both tables, we can see that forest carbon sequestration is more attractive than imposing a carbon tax. This is consistent with the literature. However, if we include the climate change impacts on agricultural productivity, we see that imposing only a carbon tax is much more cost-effective. In other words, the conclusion is reversed. We also isolated the effects of the adverse crop yields losses from the mitigation scenario, and we compared it with the business as usual. This isolation is represented in this column, and the business as usual is the last column. These calculations suggest that under both policies, mitigating losses in crop yields can result in a benefit compared to the business as usual, which means that there is incentive to mitigate. In conclusion, an aggressive forest carbon sequestration subsidy can become a threat for food security. Forest carbon sequestration is attractive if we do not consider climate-induced crop yield changes. This study has 4 important implications. 1. Developing countries are affected much more severely than developed. 2. Because of the severity of the estimated impacts, it may prove quite difficult to negotiate stringent emission reduction policies. This research highlights an important trade-off between food security and greenhouse gas reductions, especially for developing countries. 3. The results cry out for investment in agricultural research on climate adaptation. And 4. Mitigating the adverse effects on climate change could result in an economic benefit. Thank you for your attention.